April 19th. 2 different years, 2 different cities, one date that connects the deadliest siege and the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in modern American history. In 1993, a fire outside Waco, Texas, ends a 51-day standoff between a religious sect and the federal government, killing 76 people, including more than 20 children. Exactly 2 years later, to the day, a truck bomb tears the front off a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare center on the second floor. These are not two unrelated tragedies that happen to share a calendar date by coincidence. The second one happened on that date because of the first one. A 26-year-old Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh chose April 19th deliberately as an act of revenge for what he believed the federal government had done at Waco. Here's what almost every retelling of this story gets wrong, in one direction or another. Some treat Waco as a straightforward story of a dangerous cult that got what was coming to it, full stop. Others treat it as a story of the government murdering innocent people, full stop. And plenty of retellings treat Oklahoma City as a completely separate story, a crime that happened to occur on a symbolic date, rather than a crime whose entire shape, motive, and timing were built around what happened at Waco 2 years earlier. This is the real, connected story. How a religious standoff in Texas ended in fire, what government investigators actually found when they looked hard at what happened, and how that fire directly produced the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. Part 1. Who the Branch Davidians were. The Branch Davidians weren't a new phenomenon by 1993. They were an offshoot of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, a group that had splintered from the mainstream Seventh-day Adventist church back in the 1930s, and they had lived at a rural property outside Waco called Mount Carmel since the 1950s. For most of their history, they lived quietly, generally accepted by the surrounding Waco community, distinct but not widely feared. That changed with the rise of Vernon Howell, who took control of the group in the late 1980s and later legally changed his name to David Koresh. Under Koresh, the group became more insular, more apocalyptic in its theology, and more heavily armed, accumulating a substantial stockpile of firearms, and according to federal investigators, illegally converting some weapons to fully automatic and possessing unregistered explosive components. Koresh also took multiple spiritual wives, including some who were minors, and the group faced allegations of child abuse, allegations serious enough that Texas Child Protective Services investigated the compound in 1992, though that investigation was ultimately closed without charges being filed at the time. By early 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had built a case against Koresh and the group on federal weapons violations, and obtained search and arrest warrants. The ATF planned a surprise raid, using the code name Showtime, originally scheduled for March 1st, then moved up to February 28th, largely in response to a Waco Tribune-Herald newspaper series exposing allegations against Koresh, which the ATF worried would tip him off regardless. It already had. On the morning of the raid, a television cameraman covering the story, tipped off in advance, asked a local mail carrier for directions to the compound, and that mail carrier turned out to be Koresh's own brother-in-law, who immediately warned him. The element of surprise the entire operation depended on was gone before the first agent arrived. Part 2. The Raid. At 9:45 a.m. on February 28, 1993, roughly 80 ATF agents arrived at Mount Carmel to serve the warrants. Within moments, gunfire broke out. To this day, exactly who fired first remains disputed and was never conclusively established in court. The Branch Davidians maintained the ATF fired first as they approached. The government maintained agents were fired upon as they attempted to enter. What isn't disputed is what followed, a roughly 45-minute firefight, at the end of which 4 ATF agents were dead and 16 wounded. 6 Branch Davidians were killed, including several members of Korsh's own inner circle, and Korsh himself was wounded. A ceasefire was negotiated by phone, and the ATF agents withdrew from the property, but not the area. Within hours, close to 900 federal, state, and local law enforcement personnel had surrounded the compound, and the FBI's hostage rescue team took over command of what had now become a siege. Part 3, 51 days. For the next 7 weeks, the standoff played out live on television screens around the world. In the early days, there was real, if limited, progress. 10 children were released from the compound within days, and over the following weeks 19 children total were allowed to leave, along with a handful of adults. At one point, Korsh agreed to surrender the group in exchange for a taped message being broadcast nationally on Christian radio. The message aired, but Korsh did not surrender, telling negotiators that God had instructed him to wait. As the weeks dragged on without a resolution, the FBI's approach hardened. Negotiators grew increasingly frustrated with Korsh's shifting promises and religious justifications for staying. Tactical commanders, operating on a largely separate track from the negotiators, escalated psychological pressure, cutting off electricity to the compound, shining floodlights on it through the night, and blasting loud recordings, from Tibetan chants to Nancy Sinatra songs to the sound of rabbits being slaughtered, on an all-night loop, intended to deprive the group of sleep and wear down their resolve. Critics, including some of the FBI's own negotiators at the time, argued these tactics undermined the negotiation process and pushed Korsh and his followers toward deeper entrenchment rather than surrender. By mid-April, with no breakthrough after 7 weeks, Attorney General Janet Reno approved a plan to force the standoff to an end. Part 4, April 19th, 1993. Early on the morning of April 19th, FBI armored vehicles began inserting CS gas, a chemical irritant, into the compound through holes punched in the walls, intending to force the Davidians out over several hours without a direct assault. Loudspeakers announced that the building was being gassed and that this was not an assault, urging people to exit peacefully. No one came out. By early afternoon, fires broke out in multiple locations inside the compound almost simultaneously. Fanned by high winds that day, the wood-frame structure burned rapidly and almost completely. 9 people escaped the fire. 76 others did not, including more than 20 children and David Korsh himself, who died of a gunshot wound, along with several others. In what investigators concluded was part of a mass suicide and murder pact carried out as the fire spread. For years afterward, the central, furious public question was simple: who started the fire? The FBI and Justice Department maintained from early on that the Davidians themselves set it, using accelerant, in a coordinated act tied to Korsh's apocalyptic teachings, and that some of the gunfire heard during the fire was Davidians killing each other, including members who tried to escape the group's mass death plan. Surviving Branch Davidians and a substantial share of the public disputed this, and for years accused the FBI of igniting the fire itself, whether through the CS gas delivery or directly. That dispute didn't fully resolve for another 6 years. In 1999, the FBI admitted, after years of denying it, that some agents had in fact fired a small number of military pyrotechnic tear gas rounds at the compound hours before the fire broke out, rounds capable of starting fires under the right conditions, contradicting years of public statements that no such devices had been used. That admission triggered a public firestorm of its own and led Attorney General Reno to appoint former Missouri Senator John Danforth as an independent special counsel to investigate the fire and the broader conduct of federal agents on April 19th, from scratch. Danforth's investigation ran from 1999 into 2000, involving dozens of investigators and roughly $12 million in resources. His conclusion, delivered with what he personally described as 100% certainty, was that the pyrotechnic rounds fired that morning were used hours before the fire started, aimed at a separate outlying structure, and were not connected to the blaze that eventually engulfed the main building, that government agents did not start or spread the fire, that Davidians themselves spread fuel and ignited multiple fire sources, and that federal agents did not fire on Davidians as the compound burned. A separate federal civil jury, hearing a $675 million wrongful death lawsuit brought by survivors and victims' families around the same time, reached substantially similar conclusions. Danforth's report did draw a real, documented conclusion of wrongdoing, just a narrower one than the government caused the fire. He found that a small number of government lawyers and at least one FBI official had concealed from Congress, the courts, and the public the fact that pyrotechnic rounds had been used at all for roughly 6 years, and that this concealment, not the fire itself, was the government's genuine, provable failure. Part 5. Ruby Ridge, the other fire. To understand what happened 2 years later in Oklahoma City, you have to understand that Waco wasn't, in the eyes of the people it would go on to radicalize, an isolated incident. It was the second of two. In August 1992, 7 months before Waco began, U.S. Marshals attempted to arrest a man named Randy Weaver at his remote cabin in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, on a firearms charge Weaver had failed to appear in court for. An initial confrontation left a deputy U.S. Marshal and Weaver's 14-year-old son dead. During the 11-day siege that followed, an FBI sniper, operating under rules of engagement later found to be overly permissive, wounded Weaver and a family friend, and killed Weaver's wife, Vicky, as she stood in a cabin doorway holding the couple's infant daughter. To the small but growing militia and patriot movement of the early 1990s, Ruby Ridge and Waco, coming within months of each other, weren't separate events. They were proof of a single, escalating pattern, a federal government willing to use overwhelming, and in their view illegitimate, lethal force against American civilians over relatively minor legal violations. For a 24-year-old decorated Gulf War veteran named Timothy McVeigh, that pattern became personal. Part 6. MCVIGH Radicalization. McVeigh had already developed a deep suspicion of federal authority before Waco, shaped in part, by his own later account, by his experience in the Gulf War, where he grew disillusioned after witnessing Iraqi casualties he felt the government had made him complicit in. He'd also become an avid reader of the Turner Diaries, a violent white nationalist novel depicting an armed uprising against the federal government, which included a detailed fictional truck bombing of a federal building, a book that would later prove disturbingly close to McVeigh's own actions. Waco turned that general suspicion into something far more specific and urgent. During the 51-day siege itself, McVeigh actually traveled to Waco and stood among the crowd of onlookers gathered at a hill roughly 3 miles from the compound, one of the only vantage points from which civilians could see it at all, where he sold pro-gun, anti-government bumper stickers from the hood of his car. He watched the siege end in fire on live television like millions of other Americans. Unlike almost all of them, he decided it demanded retaliation. He later put it in blunt terms. What the U.S. government did to Waco and Ruby Ridge was dirty, and I gave dirty back to them at Oklahoma City. Over the following 2 years, McVeigh, together with fellow Army veteran Terry Nichols and, to a lesser extent, Michael Fortier, planned an attack on a federal building. They ultimately selected the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, a building that housed regional offices for several federal agencies, including, notably, the ATF, the same agency that had led the initial Waco raid. Part 7. The Bombing. McVeigh chose the date with total deliberation. April 19, 1995, exactly 2 years after the fire that ended Waco, and also the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, the opening battles of the American Revolution, a symbolic pairing he clearly intended. He had even used April 19th as his birth date on a fake driver's license he carried under an assumed name. Early that morning, McVeigh parked a rented Ryder truck, loaded with a homemade bomb built from agricultural fertilizer and fuel, directly outside the Murrah building, lit the fuse and walked away. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated, tearing off the building's entire north face and causing much of it to collapse. The attack killed 168 people, including 19 children in the building's second-floor daycare center, and injured roughly 680 more. It remained the deadliest act of domestic terrorism and the deadliest terror attack of any kind on American soil until September 11, 2001. McVeigh was arrested within roughly 90 minutes of the bombing, not by investigators who had identified him as a suspect, but by a state trooper who pulled him over on a routine traffic stop for a missing license plate and found him carrying a concealed, loaded handgun. He was still in custody on the unrelated weapons charge when federal investigators, working from a fragment of the truck's rear axle that survived the blast and traced back to the rental, identified him as their primary suspect. McVeigh was convicted on federal charges in 1997 and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection in June 2001. Terry Nichols was convicted on both federal and state charges for his role in planning and building the bomb and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michael Fortier, who knew of the plot in advance and helped scout the target but did not directly participate in building or detonating the bomb, cooperated with prosecutors and served roughly a decade in prison. Part 8. What historians actually get wrong. Myth 1. The federal government deliberately murdered the Branch Davidians by setting the fire at Waco. This is still one of the most widely believed claims about the standoff. A 1999 poll found 61% of Americans believed the government started the fire. But the two most thorough independent examinations of the evidence, Senator John Danforth's federal investigation and a separate federal civil jury reviewing the same events, both concluded, based on extensive forensic and eyewitness evidence, that Branch Davidians spread fuel and ignited the fire themselves, and that government agents did not fire into the compound as it burned. What the government genuinely did do wrong, and what Danforth's investigation did substantiate, was conceal for 6 years that agents had fired pyrotechnic tear gas rounds at an outlying structure hours before the fire, a real cover-up, just not the one most people believe happened. Conflating "the government concealed a fact" with "the government caused the fire" gets the specific finding backward. Myth 2. Waco was purely a religious freedom persecution. The government went after the Branch Davidians simply for their beliefs. The ATF's warrants were built on allegations of illegal fully automatic weapons conversions and unregistered explosive components, not on the group's theology, and were separately compounded by child abuse allegations serious enough to trigger a state investigation the year before the raid. That doesn't settle whether the ATF's tactical execution of the raid or the FBI's escalating pressure tactics during the siege were justified or well-judged. Reasonable people, and multiple official reviews, have criticized both. But the government persecuted a peaceful religious community for its beliefs alone, leaves out the documented weapons and abuse allegations that triggered federal involvement in the first place. Myth 3. Timothy McVeigh was a lone wolf terrorist who acted entirely alone. McVeigh was the driving force and the one who detonated the bomb, but he did not act alone. Terry Nichols was convicted as a co-conspirator directly involved in planning and constructing the device, and Michael Fortier knew of the plot in advance and helped scout the target, later testifying against both men. The bombing also didn't emerge from nowhere ideologically. McVeigh was steeped in the broader militia and patriot movement of the early 1990s and had been deeply influenced by the Turner Diaries, a novel whose fictional truck bombing plot bore an unsettling resemblance to his real one. Treating Oklahoma City as the isolated act of one radicalized individual, rather than a plot with named co-conspirators embedded in a broader extremist movement, understates both the planning behind it and the ideological current that produced it. Myth 4. Oklahoma City and Waco are two separate historical events that happen to share a calendar date. This is the myth this video exists to correct directly. McVeigh didn't stumble onto April 19th by coincidence. He chose it specifically because it was the anniversary of the Waco fire, used it as his birth date on a fake ID months before the bombing, and stated explicitly, in his own words, that the attack was retaliation for Waco and Ruby Ridge. The two events aren't parallel tragedies that historians happen to discuss together. One is the direct, deliberately dated, explicitly stated cause of the other's timing, and by McVeigh's own account, its underlying motive.